She had no idea that the daughter her family had spent 9 years describing, among themselves, as someone who had chosen to walk away, the convenient, simplified story they told relatives and neighbors and, eventually, came to believe themselves, was the only person in their entire extended family whose blood type, tissue markers, and decade of careful, deliberate health maintenance made her the single viable living donor match for the man lying in a transplant unit in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, who did not have the kind of time that waiting for a deceased donor match would require. My family cut me off over one lie. They never asked me whether it was actually true. 9 years later, a transplant coordinator called my cell phone, read my name off a list I did not know I was on, and explained that I was the only match they had found for my father's failing liver. This is the story of what that one lie actually was, what it cost me to be falsely blamed for it for 9 years, and what I eventually chose to do when the family that exiled me discovered they needed me to survive. My name is Solveig Marchetti Hale. I am 34 years old. I am a clinical laboratory scientist at a regional hospital system in Cleveland, Ohio, specializing in transfusion medicine and tissue typing, the specific, exacting work of determining, with scientific precision, exactly which biological materials are compatible between specific human bodies. A profession, I want to note, carries a particular, almost unbearable irony, given what eventually happened in this story, because I had spent 9 years estranged from a family that ultimately needed, with desperate and unambiguous clarity, the exact kind of biological compatibility my own professional life was built around understanding. I tell you my profession first because it shapes, considerably, how I eventually processed the call that arrived 9 years into my estrangement, not with the dramatic, overwhelming shock the moment might have produced in someone without my specific training, but with a particular, careful clarity about exactly what the coordinator was telling me, and exactly what it would require of me to decide what to do about it. My father's name is Holger Marchetti Hale. He is 66 years old. My mother is Beatrice, 63. I have one sibling, my older brother Tobias, who is 38, married with 2 children, working as a regional sales director for a manufacturing equipment company in Pittsburgh, where my parents had also relocated 11 years ago, following my father's retirement from a long career in structural engineering. I want to describe, as precisely and honestly as I can, exactly what happened 9 years ago, because the entire foundation of this story depends on understanding the lie itself. Not in vague, general terms, but specifically, because the specificity is the entire point. Tobias's marriage at the time was navigating a period of genuine difficulty. He and his wife, Penelope, had separated briefly, approximately 10 years ago, for reasons that I understood, at the time, only partially, given that Tobias had never been especially forthcoming with me about the actual substance of his marital difficulties, preferring, as he generally did, to manage family information selectively rather than openly. During this separation, Tobias began, by his own later admission, an affair with a coworker, a fact I learned about not through any deliberate investigation on my part, but because Penelope, struggling and isolated during the separation, had confided in me directly, treating me, at the time, as someone she trusted enough to share what she was going through, given our own genuine friendship that had developed across the years of her marriage to my brother. I did not, at the time, share this information with anyone else in the family. I want to be completely clear about that, because it is the entire crux of what eventually happened. I kept Penelope's confidence. I did not tell my parents. I did not confront Tobias directly about it. I simply held what I knew privately, the way I believed any reasonable person would hold information shared with them in confidence, by someone going through a painful, vulnerable period in her own marriage. What happened, approximately 8 months later, once Tobias and Penelope had reconciled and resumed their marriage, was considerably more complicated than my own careful discretion could ultimately control. Penelope, in the process of working through her own healing from that period, in therapy, in conversations with her own closest friends, in the ordinary, human process of processing a genuinely painful betrayal, eventually told someone else what had happened. That information, through a chain of second-hand conversation I never fully traced and have never been able to fully reconstruct, eventually reached my mother, approximately a year after the affair itself had ended, framed, by the time it reached her, in language that specifically and incorrectly identified me as the original source of the disclosure. My mother confronted me directly at a family dinner in front of my father and Tobias, accusing me of having deliberately spread information about Tobias's affair, specifically to damage his marriage and his standing within the family. I denied this, immediately and completely, because it was entirely untrue. I explained as clearly as I could in that moment that I had known about the affair, that Penelope had told me directly, and that I had never told anyone else. Not my parents, not any extended family member, not anyone outside the small circle of Penelope's own closest confidantes, whom I had never had any contact with regarding the matter at all. My family did not believe me. I want to describe, honestly, exactly why my family chose not to believe my denial, because I think understanding their reasoning, however flawed, matters to understanding the actual shape of what happened over the following 9 years. Tobias, defensive and humiliated by the resurfacing of his own affair within the family's collective awareness, insisted, with considerable conviction, that I was the only person who could have been the source, given that I was the only family member who had known about the situation at all during the period it occurred. He did not, as far as I am aware, ever specifically consider or investigate the possibility that Penelope herself, processing her own genuine pain, had simply told someone else entirely, in a conversation that had nothing to do with me. My mother, I believe, found it considerably easier to accept Tobias's version of events, that his sister had betrayed him out of some unspecified jealousy or resentment, than to sit with the more complicated, ambiguous truth that the actual source of the disclosure was simply unknown, and that her son's own affair, rather than any sister's betrayal, was the actual underlying cause of the family's pain in the first place. My father, throughout this entire process, said remarkably little, deferring, as he generally did in family conflicts, to my mother's judgment rather than forming or expressing any independent assessment of his own. I was told, at that dinner, and in the weeks that followed, that I was no longer welcome at family gatherings, that my betrayal of Tobias was not something the family was prepared to simply move past, and that I should understand, going forward, that my relationship with all of them, not just Tobias, but my parents as well, was, in my mother's specific words, going to need to exist at a considerable distance until you're willing to actually own what you did. I never owned what I did because I had not done it. I spent the following several months attempting, repeatedly, to clarify the actual situation. Calling my parents, writing letters, even, at one point, asking Penelope directly whether she would be willing to confirm, to my parents, that she herself had been the one who eventually told someone else what had happened. Penelope, I want to note honestly, was not willing to do this. I do not believe this reflects any particular malice on her part. I believe rather that she was navigating her own complicated, ongoing relationship with Tobias and with my parents, and that confirming, explicitly, that she had been the actual source of the family's awareness, would have created a different, perhaps equally painful set of consequences for her own marriage. Consequences she was not prepared to risk on my behalf. I do not blame her for this, even now. I want to be direct about that. I understand, with considerably more clarity at 34 than I possessed at 25, exactly how complicated and self-protective people become when navigating their own painful situations. And I do not believe Penelope owed me a sacrifice of her own marital peace simply to clear my name within a family that had already, by that point, largely decided what story it preferred to believe. I need to plant several details here that matter enormously to what follows. The first, in the years following my exile from the family's gatherings and ordinary contact, I built, deliberately and with considerable discipline, a life centered substantially around the specific scientific precision my profession required. A discipline that, I believe in retrospect, served as a kind of psychological anchor during a period when my own family's version of events had effectively erased the actual truth of what had happened and replaced it with a story I had no power to correct. I maintained, throughout this entire period, careful and consistent health habits, regular medical checkups, a disciplined approach to diet and exercise that I had developed initially for entirely unrelated reasons related to my own family history of cardiovascular disease, but that had the incidental, long-term effect of maintaining my own body in a condition of genuine, measurable good health across the following decade. The second detail: approximately 5 years into my estrangement, my father was diagnosed with a chronic liver condition, a slow, progressive disease that his physicians, at the time, characterized as serious but manageable through medication and lifestyle modification, not yet requiring the kind of intervention that would eventually become necessary. I learned about this diagnosis not from any direct family communication, but secondhand, through a cousin who had remained in occasional contact with me across the years of estrangement, and who mentioned it, in passing, during an otherwise unrelated conversation. I did not reach out to my father directly, at the time, given the specific, unresolved nature of our estrangement, and given that I had no reason to believe my reaching out would be welcomed, rather than simply rebuffed, as my previous attempts at contact had consistently been in the years immediately following the initial conflict. The third detail: I had, throughout this entire period, never updated any medical directive, organ donation registration, or family contact information that might have specifically excluded my father or my family more broadly from being notified, should circumstances ever require it, that I existed as a potential biological match for any medical need that might eventually arise. A fact that became significant considerably later, in a way I had never specifically anticipated when I simply never thought to update those administrative details during the years of our estrangement. There is a particular kind of injustice that does not announce itself dramatically, in any single identifiable moment, but instead accumulates, quietly, across years. A family's collective decision to believe a simpler, more convenient story, rather than sit with the more complicated truth, and the specific, durable cost that decision imposes on the one person who knows, with complete certainty, exactly how false the convenient story actually is. My father's liver condition progressed, over the years following his initial diagnosis, considerably more rapidly than his physicians had originally anticipated. A deterioration that I learned about, again secondhand, through the same cousin, approximately 8 years into my estrangement, when he mentioned that my father had begun the formal evaluation process for a liver transplant. I want to be honest that I did not, at that point, immediately consider reaching out, given the specific, unresolved nature of our family's relationship, and given my own genuine uncertainty about whether any contact from me would be welcomed, or would simply reopen a wound that had, by that point, scarred over into something my family had apparently learned to live with. The call that changed this calculation arrived 9 years after the original conflict, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, while I was at work, reviewing tissue compatibility results for an entirely unrelated patient case. The call came from a transplant coordinator at a hospital system in Pittsburgh, a woman named Annika Foss, who identified herself carefully and explained, with the specific, practiced compassion of someone who delivers exactly this kind of call regularly, that she was contacting me regarding a potential living donor match for a patient currently on the liver transplant waiting list. "I want to explain how you came to be contacted," Annika said, "because I understand this call may be unexpected. Your father, Holger Marchetti Hale, has been on our transplant list for the past several months, and his condition has progressed to a point where his physicians believe a living donor transplant offers considerably better outcomes than continuing to wait for a deceased donor match, given his specific deterioration timeline." I sat very still at my desk, processing this with the specific, careful precision my professional training brought to receiving any significant clinical information. As part of our standard protocol for identifying potential living donors, Anika continued, we conduct outreach to biological family members who may be compatible matches based on blood type and preliminary tissue marker information that's sometimes already on file from prior medical history. Your name appeared in your father's family medical history documentation, and our preliminary screening indicated you share blood type compatibility and several relevant tissue markers that make you a potentially strong candidate pending further testing. I need to be direct with you, I said, about something relevant to this conversation. My father and I have been estranged for 9 years. I haven't had any direct contact with him or with most of my family during that time. Anika's voice, when she responded, carried a specific, careful neutrality that I recognized, professionally, as exactly the appropriate register for a coordinator navigating a situation she likely encountered, in some form, more often than people outside the transplant world might assume. I appreciate you telling me that directly, she said. I want to be clear that my role here is simply to provide you with accurate medical information and to ask whether you'd be willing to be evaluated as a potential donor. Whatever decision you make, for whatever reasons are relevant to you, is entirely your own. I'm not here to advocate for any specific outcome beyond making sure you have the information you need to make that decision. Does my father know you're contacting me? I asked. He's aware that the hospital is conducting outreach to potential family matches as part of his evaluation. Anika said, he has not specifically requested that we contact you, given the circumstances you've described. This outreach was generated through our standard protocol, based on the family medical history documentation on file, rather than through any specific request from him. I sat with this distinction for a long moment, understanding, with a specific clarity, exactly what it meant. My father had not reached out to me, even now, even facing what I understood professionally to be a genuinely serious and time-sensitive medical situation. The hospital's own systematic process had simply identified me, mechanically, as a biologically compatible match, entirely independent of whether my father himself had any interest in my involvement. What would the evaluation process actually involve? I asked, because I understood, even in that first moment of disorientation, that I needed considerably more information before I could make any decision about how to respond. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives when a decision that feels, on its surface, enormous and emotionally overwhelming, is broken down into its actual, sequential, procedural components, when the specific medical and logistical reality of a situation displaces, briefly, the larger, more complicated emotional weight surrounding it, simply because that procedural reality is the only part of the situation a person can actually act on directly. I want to describe the days that followed this initial call honestly, because I believe the actual texture of my own decision-making process matters considerably more than a simple, dramatic account of immediate, unconflicted generosity. I did not decide immediately to proceed with the evaluation. I want to be direct about that, because I believe the honesty of my own hesitation matters to understanding the eventual resolution. I spent several days, following Anika's call, genuinely uncertain about what I wanted to do. Caught between the specific professional clarity my own training brought to understanding exactly what a living liver donation would require of me, physically and medically, and the considerably more complicated, unresolved grief of 9 years spent being falsely blamed for a betrayal I had never committed, by a family that had never once, in 9 years, reached out to ask whether their version of events might be incomplete. I called my cousin, the one who had kept me loosely informed across the years of estrangement, and asked him directly whether my father or anyone else in the family had any awareness that the hospital had specifically contacted me. I don't think so, he told me. I think your dad assumed, going into this evaluation, that you'd either already moved on too far to be considered, or that the family situation made it not worth bringing up. I don't think anyone's actually expecting you to be the one who calls. I sat with this information for a considerable time, understanding, with a specific and somewhat painful clarity, that my family had apparently not even considered me a genuine possibility, not because they had concluded I would refuse, but because the 9 years of estrangement had become so thoroughly normalized within their own understanding of our family, that the idea of actually reaching out to me, even facing a genuinely life-threatening medical situation, had simply not occurred to anyone as a viable option worth pursuing. I scheduled the preliminary compatibility testing 3 days after Annika's initial call, choosing to proceed at that stage, simply to understand the actual medical facts of the situation, separate entirely from any decision about whether I would eventually move forward with an actual donation, and separate, too, from any decision about whether or how I would communicate directly with my family during this process. The preliminary testing confirmed what Annika's initial screening had suggested. I was, in fact, a strong biological match for my father, blood type compatible, with tissue markers that her transplant team's specialist characterized, in the follow-up call explaining the results as an unusually favorable match profile, the kind of compatibility that, combined with my own measurably good health across the preceding decade, made me, by their clinical assessment, the single strongest living donor candidate identified through their entire outreach process, considerably stronger than any other family member who had been screened. I want to describe what happened next, because I believe the specific sequence, who I chose to contact first, and in what order, matters considerably to understanding how I eventually navigated this entire situation. I did not call my father directly. I called my mother, instead, choosing her specifically because I believed, based on 9 years of reflection about the original conflict, that she had been the primary architect of the family's decision to believe Tobias's version of events over my own denial, and because I wanted, before agreeing to anything further, to have a direct conversation with her about exactly what had happened 9 years earlier. I received a call from a transplant coordinator, I told her once she had answered, her voice carrying immediate, visible shock at hearing from me after 9 years of silence. I'm a match for Dad. I want to talk about that, but I also need to talk about something else first, because I don't think I can move forward with one without addressing the other directly. Solveig, my mother said, and I want to note that her voice carried, even in that single word, a specific quality of overwhelmed uncertainty that I had genuinely never heard from her before, across the entirety of our relationship. I don't know what to say. We didn't ask them to call you. I want you to know that. I know, I said. Annika told me that directly. I want to be clear about why I'm calling you specifically before Dad. I have spent 9 years being blamed for something I did not do. I told you, at the time, exactly what actually happened, that Penelope told me about the affair, that I never told anyone else, and that whoever eventually told you was not me. You chose not to believe that. I need to know, before I decide anything else, whether you're actually willing to revisit that now, honestly, or whether you're simply hoping I'll set it aside because Dad is sick. The silence that followed carried, I believe, the specific weight of a woman confronting, directly and without the convenient distance of 9 years habituated avoidance, exactly what she had chosen to believe and exactly why. I think, my mother said finally, her voice considerably smaller than I had ever heard it. I think I believed Tobias, because believing him was easier than sitting with what he'd actually done. I think it was easier to be angry at you for supposedly telling people than to be angry at my own son for the affair itself. I think I've known that, somewhere, for a long time, and never let myself actually look at it directly, because looking at it directly would have meant admitting I'd wronged you for 9 years, over something I never actually had any real proof of. I sat with this admission for a long moment, understanding, with a specific and considerable weight, exactly what it represented. Not a full resolution, not an instant repair of 9 years of damage, but the first genuinely honest acknowledgement I had received from any member of my family since the entire conflict began. Thank you for saying that, I said. I need you to understand that I'm not telling you this to extract an apology before I'll consider helping Dad. Those are genuinely separate questions for me, and I want to be honest about that. But I couldn't move forward with the medical side of this without finally saying, directly, what I've needed to say for 9 years. Will you help him? My mother asked, and I want to note, honestly, the specific vulnerability in the question, the recognition, finally arriving, that whatever I decided was entirely my own choice to make, not an obligation the family retained any standing to demand. I need to talk to him directly, I said, and I need Tobias to actually hear directly from me what really happened 9 years ago, because I'm not interested in walking back into this family quietly, as though none of it happened, simply because Dad's situation has made the old conflict suddenly inconvenient to maintain. There is a particular kind of leverage that arrives not from threat or manipulation, but from the simple, undeniable fact of being needed by people who spent years deciding you were not worth believing. Leverage that does not require being used cruelly to be genuinely, completely real. I spoke with my father directly, 2 days later, in a phone call that I want to describe with the same care I have tried to bring to every other significant conversation in this account. I didn't want them to call you, he said, early in the conversation, his voice carrying the specific frailty of a man whose physical condition had clearly deteriorated considerably across the years I had been absent from his life. I told the hospital, when they explained their outreach protocol, that I didn't think it was fair to put you in this position, given everything. I appreciate you saying that, I said. I want you to know I'm not upset that they called. I'm processing a lot of things at once, but the call itself isn't one of the things I'm upset about. Your mother told me what she said to you, he said. About believing Tobias. I want to say something too, because I think I bear more responsibility for this than I ever let myself admit across all these years. Go ahead, I said. I never actually formed my own opinion about what happened, he said. 9 years ago. I just deferred to your mother, the way I always have with anything difficult in this family. I didn't ask you enough questions. I didn't push Tobias to explain why he was so certain, beyond his own wounded pride. I just let the easier story stand, because forming my own honest assessment would have required actually engaging with how angry I was at my own son, rather than simply being angry at you instead, because being angry at you required less of me. I sat with this admission, understanding with a specific and considerable weight that my father, quiet, deferential, rarely willing to assert an independent position throughout my entire life, was offering me, in this moment, possibly the most direct and honest accounting of his own failure that he had ever given anyone in our family. I'm sorry, he said. 9 years late, and arriving now only because I'm sick and you're apparently the only person who can help me. I understand if that timing makes the apology feel hollow. I want to give it anyway, because it's true regardless of when I'm finally saying it. It doesn't feel hollow, I said, and I want to be honest that my own voice, in that moment, carried considerably more emotion than I had managed to maintain throughout the rest of this entire process. It feels 9 years late. Both of those things are true at once. I want to describe, carefully, exactly what I decided, because I believe the specific shape of my decision matters considerably more than any dramatic account of either pure, uncomplicated forgiveness or righteous, permanent refusal. I proceeded with the full donor evaluation, and, after several additional weeks of testing, confirmed my continued suitability. I underwent the living donor liver transplant procedure, 6 weeks after Annika's initial call, donating a portion of my own liver to my father in a procedure performed at the same Pittsburgh hospital system that had first contacted me. I want to be direct about why I made this decision, because I believe the honesty of my reasoning matters considerably more than a simple, satisfying narrative of unconditional family loyalty triumphing over 9 years of justified grievance. I did not donate because I had forgiven my family completely, or because the conversations with my mother and father had fully repaired 9 years of accumulated damage. I donated because I had assessed, with the same careful, professional clarity I brought to every other significant decision in my life, that my father's actual medical need was real and severe, that I was, by every clinical measure, an unusually strong match capable of helping him survive, and that the specific question of whether to save his life was, for me, ultimately separate from the considerably more complicated, ongoing question of how I intended to navigate my relationship with the rest of my family going forward. I want to be direct about something, I told my father in the days before the procedure, during one of several in-person visits that represented the first time I had seen him face-to-face in 9 years. I am doing this because you are my father, and because I am capable of saving your life, and I don't think withholding that capability would actually serve anything except my own anger. But I need you to understand that this procedure does not automatically restore everything that happened before it. We're going to need to actually rebuild an honest relationship, slowly, separate from the fact that I'm currently in a hospital bed, donating part of my liver to you. I don't want gratitude to become a substitute for the actual reckoning this family still needs to have. I understand, he said. I don't expect this to fix 9 years. I just hope it's a place we can actually start from honestly, instead of the place we were stuck in before. The procedure itself proceeded successfully. My father's recovery, in the months that followed, progressed steadily, and his transplant team described his outcomes, at each subsequent evaluation, as exceeding their initial expectations, a fact I received with the specific, professional satisfaction my own training allowed me to genuinely appreciate, separate from whatever complicated family emotions accompanied it. My conversation with Tobias occurred several weeks after the procedure itself, once I had recovered sufficiently to travel, and once I had decided deliberately that I wanted this conversation to happen in person rather than over the phone, given its specific significance to the actual reckoning I had told my father I still needed. I know what actually happened. I told him, directly, once we were alone. Penelope told me about the affair during your separation because she needed someone to talk to and she trusted me. I never told anyone else. Whoever eventually told Mom was not me, and I think, somewhere, you've probably known that for a while, even if it was easier to keep believing I was the one who betrayed you. Tobias was quiet for a long moment, and I want to note, honestly, that his eventual response carried less defensiveness than I had braced myself to encounter. I think I needed it to be you, he said finally, because the alternative was sitting with what I'd actually done, and with the fact that Penelope had been hurting badly enough to need to tell someone, anyone, about it. It was easier to be furious at my sister than to actually face what I'd put my own wife through. I understand why that was easier, I said. I don't think understanding it makes 9 years okay. I think you owe me a real accounting of that, separate from whatever gratitude is currently floating around this family, because I happened to be a good liver match. You're right, he said. I'm sorry. Genuinely, completely sorry, not because Dad needed your liver, but because what I did to you was wrong, regardless of how this medical situation happened to unfold. I think often about the specific, strange mechanism through which this entire reckoning eventually arrived. Not through any dramatic confrontation I orchestrated, not through any document or legal structure, but through the simple biological fact of compatibility, identified by a hospital's systematic outreach protocol that forced a family who had spent 9 years comfortably avoiding an honest accounting to finally, urgently, need the one person they had decided was not worth believing. I do not believe my father's illness was, in any sense, a fortunate or meaningful event simply because it eventually produced an honest family reckoning. I want to be direct about that, because I think it would be easy, in the retelling, to frame this story as some kind of redemptive arc in which suffering produced a necessary and valuable correction. I do not believe that. I believe my father's illness was simply a serious, frightening medical crisis that happened, through entirely mechanical biological circumstance, to also become the occasion through which a family finally had to look honestly at a wrong it had spent 9 years avoiding. What I do believe, with considerably more confidence, is that the honesty which eventually emerged. My mother's admission about choosing the easier story, my father's accounting of his own deference and silence, Tobias's genuine acknowledgement of what he had actually done, would likely never have arrived at all, absent the specific, urgent pressure of his medical need forcing a reckoning that 9 years of my own attempts at reconciliation had never been sufficient to produce on their own. Sometimes the truth a family has avoided for years does not surface through patience or through forgiveness offered repeatedly until it is finally received, but through the blunt, undeniable pressure of circumstance, a hospital's systematic protocol, a biological compatibility no one anticipated, a need so urgent that avoidance simply becomes impossible to sustain any longer. The truth was always there, waiting. It simply required something considerably more forceful than hope to finally make a family look at it directly. And that is what happened 9 years after my family cut me off over a lie I never told. A transplant coordinator in Pittsburgh, working from nothing more than a standard medical outreach protocol, identified me, mechanically, and without any awareness of our family's history, as the one person capable of saving my father's life, and in doing so, finally created the specific urgent circumstance that 9 years of my own attempts at honest reconciliation had never been able to produce on their own. I was the only match. I was also, the entire time, telling the truth. It took a hospital, rather than my own family, to finally treat both of those facts as equally, undeniably real.